Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this seminar organized by the Center of Mexican Studies at UCLA. Before introducing our guest speaker, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement just to remind us about our history and how the university is built on native land. So the Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga people. Welcome to this first webinar of winter quarter. In this webinar, we'll continue our conversation about the main political, cultural, and social issues affecting Mexico in the present. We will continue this conversation with two more webinars this quarter. So on February 12th, we'll have Pablo Picato, who just published a book, A Brief History of Violence in Mexico by the University of North Carolina Press. And also, our third and last webinar will be with a professor based in Oaxaca, Juan Carlos Sánchez Antonio, who just published a book on La Filosofía de los Zapotecas. And that's in commemoration of International Indigenous Languages. So welcome, and I'm so excited about our conversation today. We have Kate Linthicum, the foreign correspondent of the LA Times in Mexico City, who's been very busy lately writing in-depth stories covering main issues of dealing with Mexico. So we have a great opportunity to have our hometown newspaper correspondent in Mexico City talking to us in depth about her reporting in Mexico City and what's going on behind the scenes behind those articles. So I want to welcome everyone. If you have a question, please, you can write your questions in the Q&A icon, and we're gonna talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll address the questions that all of you might have. So welcome. Kate, it's a pleasure to be talking to you. And I wonder if you could introduce yourself. Give us your biographical paragraph. How is it? What were you doing before getting to Mexico City?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've known you for a long time, Gaspar, and I'm such a fan of your work and rely so much on UCLA academics and research. So it's really an honor to be here. Thank you. So I am a correspondent at the LA Times. I got to the LA Times when I was quite young. I started as an intern there and covered a lot of different topics in LA. I covered LA City Hall for a number of years, immigration, like the agencies kind of conducting immigration enforcement, and then did some politics. So I covered a couple presidential campaigns, including about half of the 2016 campaign, following Trump and writing a lot about kind of his very inflammatory rhetoric around immigration, and then got sent to Mexico City. So I arrived here in, I think, August of 2016, which is almost 10 years ago now.
Okay, it'll be 10 years this year. Wow, this summer. That's interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about how was it to start reporting from Mexico City? Do you have any memorable stories that you want to share with us from those early years in Mexico City? It seems like a very different time period. How was Mexico at that time?
Yeah, I mean, it was a fascinating time because it was the last legs of the Peña Nieto presidency. So we had a priest in power, and getting to see kind of what the pre looked like in this sort of odd comeback that it had with him. Ayotzinapa was very much on people's minds. There were regular marches in the streets. And then you had Trump, who was coming to power in the United States. And I think actually the very first story I did, he came here to Los Pinos and appeared alongside Peña Nieto. He was still a candidate. And it was really a harbinger of what's to come, because I think Trump, and particularly the way he's talked about Mexico, it's very much an informed sort of U.S. policy um, for the last 10 years. And so I think it was a good preview for how we would think about that bilateral relationship in the years to come.
That's great. And then you witnessed the first important moment of political transition in Mexico, and that was the election after Peña Nieto, right? When for the third time Andres Manuel was running and he
Yeah,
finally won. How was that? I mean, how did it feel? I mean, it was a momentous political
yeah.
moment.
Yeah, I mean, it was an incredibly exciting time here. I think, there was this sense of just like great disillusionment with the democratic transition that had happened about, 16 years earlier. And a lot of people who felt that, Mexico now had this democracy, but wasn't getting, um, the good stuff that's supposed to come along with it. Homicides were at really high levels. Violence was really spiraling out of control in many parts of the country. And of course, inequality was sort of worse than ever. So there was this, I think a lot like in the United States, just this anger at elites, at political elites. And so you had, like this message that I think AMLO had been, you know, carrying for decades, really kind of just at something about that moment, it just really hit and resonated with people. Um, you had for the first time in decades a president who was talking about poverty in a place where so many people live in poverty. So it's like like sort of Bernie Sanders. He just really was able to galvanize people. And it was very exciting. I mean, he was the opposite of Peña Nieto. He went to, I think, every county in Mexico. He campaigned there. He was on the ground, in parts of the country that had long been kind of forgotten. So it was very exciting going out and campaigning with him and like feeling that energy. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and then it's been fascinating watching, sort of how a lot of that like great hope has been maintained. A lot of people still really love him and Morena, but there's
Right.
also been like a big amount of backlash.
Okay, we want to get more into detail, but I wonder if you could share with our audience, were you able to go to Las Mañaneras at the National Palace? How did it feel? Because I think that was one major innovation in the political system. The fact that the president was addressing the nation every morning. I don't know, people sort of got tired of it at the beginning, but he got such the president, he was actually leading, announcing the headlines for the day. How was that? And can you describe for us what it did feel like to go to the National Palace to these mañaneras?
Yeah, I mean, he was just a master of these incredibly symbolic populist acts. He
Mm,
he basically said, "I'm not going to live in the presidential palace in the White House. I'm going to turn it into a museum for the people." Um,
that
he
Los Pinos were
Los
the, if you can
Pinos.
describe, yeah, for people, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Los Pinos. It's basically the Casa Blanca of Mexico, he said, instead I'm going to live in this very austere apartment in my offices, basically at the Palacio Nacional in Centro. So, he did a national raffle to raffle off the presidential airplane because he decided to fly coach. I mean, I know people who are on like Viva Aerobus flights with the president. Um, and I think the Mañanera like really encapsulated this. He rose very early every morning, every single day of his presidency, and talked to the nation directly. And he was plain spoken. He often digressed for very long rambling, kind of history lessons. And um, he often attacked, what he called was the mafia de poder, these economic and political elites who had long controlled the country. But what he did was he controlled the conversation, and he made people feel like, he was very present in their lives. You would drive around in taxis here and just, walk by like taquerias, and his voice is just like echoing constantly. So he really became, I mean, I think he's like the most important political figure in Mexico for so long, and honestly globally too.
Mhm.
And I'm always
Mhm.
surprised that more, and I think there has been, some kind of leaders elsewhere who have looked to that model. And I think there's been plenty of comparisons with aspects of Trump and how he communicates. Um, but yeah, it was just a phenomenon, quite a phenomenon to be able to watch.
So, could you share with us, describe, I mean, how early you have to get up? What is the process for a reporter to get access? How's the room there? What did it feel like? Uh,
Yeah.
because they started really early, right? That was one of the signature
Yes.
things that he was doing.
Yeah, no, I mean you're getting up at 5 a.m. To be in line by 6 a.m. and then it started at 7. Um, and the process was fairly straightforward for international media to get access. Another thing that AMLO did was he also gave a lot of like YouTuber kind of influencer types access to the mañaneras, which was just another way to kind of disseminate his message more broadly. Um, Also, I think it meant that he got some friendly questions in there because a lot of them were kind of pro Morena. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it was really quite an opportunity, quite an exercise in democracy to know that on any given day you could sit in the same room as the president, and perhaps if you were lucky, get to ask him a question. Um, and that was at a time, like when the Biden administration came in, Biden, I think he gave very, very, very few news conferences. And, as his presidency wore on, was so like really retreated from the public eye. And so that was a real contrast. And Shane Baum, of course, has continued this tradition, I think, very wisely. Although, stylistically, she could not be more different than him. So I'd say her press conferences last about 1/4 the amount of time that his used to, and we're
Oh,
grateful for that, frankly.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and before we move on to Clashing, but I know everybody wants to talk about her. I wonder if you remember any questions that you asked Andres Manuel, and how was he engaging? How would he engage with reporters? Would he be a straight shooter, or would he digress and go to, how was that
Yeah,
experience? I don't know if you remember any
yeah. I mean,
instance.
I should say, like, you had the opportunity to ask a question, and that was an incredible privilege. But that did not guarantee that you would get like a straight answer. I mean, he was very talented at kind of um, evading or changing topic when he wanted to. I remember one question I asked. I think, gosh, I can't remember the exact sort of. Um, there were the opposition was like waging these protests. They were calling people to the street. It might have had to do. It was with some reform. I can't remember which one. Probably to the INE, to the voting system, to the way elections were held. And the opposition was saying this is part of this democratic unraveling that you are pushing in Mexico, this authoritarian power grab. And AMLO every day kind of went toe to toe with them, and every day was criticizing a new billionaire or and so at a certain point, this was, I think, when in the US, like, political tensions were quite high, and I think I asked a question just about like, is this polarization that is happening in Mexico healthy? Are you contributing to that? And oh, yeah, he didn't like that question very much. And I think gave like a 20-minute answer where, he was talking about Benito Juarez. And yeah, he digressed. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, he was very, very, very set in his ways, and kind of continued to be that real lightning rod political
Oh,
figure.
yeah, that's great. So this is setting up the context of the election of Clash Inbound. You have a very popular president who's on the one hand trying to revamp the entire process, the political process, how the president conducts the country. Very populist, very well liked, but very polarizing figure too. The opposition entrenched, I think. And they tried again. They formed a coalition against Morena, and it wasn't clear that Claudia would emerge. I mean, it was a internal contested competition. There were some big names as the pre-candidates for Morena. Um, if you remember that moment, how, I mean, were you thinking in looking at the candidates, in looking at Claudia Sheinbaum, that she had any chance to emerge as the front runner? Or did you have some already inside information that she was the front runner? How was that election and your coverage of it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I thought that Claudia was, in terms of just her basic kind of bona fides, was the strongest candidate. She had led Mexico City, that has traditionally been a path to presidential power here, and she had done a lot of good. Homicides fell in Mexico City. There has been this sense here that of a lot of kind of economic prosperity, even though there are also concerns about kind of housing costs and all of that. But she had a good track record, and I thought was more charismatic and more interesting than like a Marcelo Ebrard, who's a bit of a technocrat, and to me at least, although his politics are different, has kind of the demeanor of a lot of kind of the technocrat leaders that I think a lot of people are sort of tired of. But I wasn't sure that whether a woman could really win, whether a woman could really, be nominated and win. And I think a lot of people were. I was sort of surprised by how that really didn't appear to be an issue for most people. And I think it kind of goes back to this. There's I think a lot of there is a lot of misogyny in Mexico, like in other cultures, including the United States. But just sort of these probably racist like characterizations that people in a lot of other countries have about kind of Latin America. So it was, to me, like really quite telling that Mexico ended up having a female president, more female members of Congress, than the United States, and so it was kind of a just, yeah, again, like AMLO, kind of this very exciting moment where you realized this was going to be a government that was very much led by women, unlike any other country in this continent, and even though I think the shadow of AMLO continued to be very present, because she very clearly said, I'm going to be continuing, the transformation, this battle for equality that he had started.
Mhm. Like a political moment, I mean, you mentioned the fact that Claudia was able to overcome all the other males within her party to become the candidate. But also there were transformations in the political system in Mexico that allow for gender party, for example. I think that we didn't discuss much about that, but I think um, I don't know if you can reflect on that. What it was a very deliberate process that political reforms that brought about actually more women into the political process. And in a way, all parties had to rise to the occasion and nominate women. And in Congress, all of a sudden change, right, with 50% women. And the fact that Claudia was leading as the presidential candidate. And also there was another woman from the opposition, actually. So it became a contest of two women with very different narratives. I mean, can you share with us? And at the same time, there were a lot of course, on the people who didn't agree with this process, who had problems, right? And also people, even radical people, who were saying this is not ending violence against women, which has been an issue. I don't know if you can remember that moment where, there were so many changes happening in Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of getting at this. There are some tensions or some ironies in a way. You're right. Like I don't think Sheinbaum was elected the first female president in Mexico by accident, because Mexico is this, relatively young democracy. Going back 20 years ago when people were sort of figuring out, well, what do we want our elections to look like? There was a push by feminists to say, yeah, we want to require parties to run a female candidate in at least 50% of elections. And that has totally transformed the makeup of the legislatures, governorships, and the presidency here. So you have had that kind of happening, and you had this monumental election of Sheinbaum, who was just an avowed feminist and said frequently and continues to say, this is not just my arrival here. This is the arrival of all women, which is, again, just shows this like very savvy kind of political populist messaging that she and Lopez Obrador have very much embraced. But you had at the same time of this, this kind of incredible female leader. Yeah, you continue to have just extremely high rates of violence against women and femicides, and a lot of anger in the street about harassment and discrimination in the workplace. And so there have been tensions with that, and I think it was it's been so telling. You would have these kind of feminist protests directly outside the Palacio National Palace, where you had the first female president. And you saw that in sort of other ways too. I mean, you had this leftist, in theory, government, but then it wasn't sort of radical enough for many leftists in the country. So yeah, I mean, and also to win, right? Like AMLO had to bring together this very broad coalition that was not just leftist; it was old members of the PRI, and it's a very big tent. And so Morena is a very complicated beast, even though it is ostensibly like this very leftist movement. It's a lot more complicated than that, and a lot of its figureheads are not so perfect either, because you had, for example, this Morena governor who was accused of rape by many people. So yeah, I mean, I think those tensions are very relevant. I think Sheinbaum has done a pretty good job of addressing them. I don't know if you remember, but a few months ago, she was actually like harassed in public.
Right.
She was,
Can you elaborate a
yeah,
little bit about that, because it wasn't clear
yeah.
what
Again,
happened? Yeah.
in a very populist kind of style, she was walking through the Zocalo from a meeting in one government building to another, and this like drunk guy approached her. There was a group of people taking pictures, and he like groped her and was quickly pulled off. But instead of being silent about it, she filed a case against him. She filed a complaint against him. She talked about this, said it's not okay. So it's been very interesting to see how she's kind of handled these themes that are very potent here.
Mhm. I wonder if you can reflect on this issue about that was talked a lot in the news, and people were wondering whether or not, as a woman, she would be able to free from AMLO's mantle. Of course, there were very structural issues that Andres Manuel left, the connection with the army and the importance of the armed forces in the economy, in the public sector, the welcoming that he did with a lot of panistas and priistas opening the tent for that you're describing. Uh, the idea that a woman, right, follow the most popular president to date. How is she doing in that question? Has she come on her own terms now? And is this her Mexico, her political and economy? How would you reflect on that a year after her
Yeah,
inauguration?
I think that's a great question. And I'm not sure I fully have the answer, but I think I have been impressed. For one, I'm impressed that AMLO really has
Mhm.
left the public sphere. He's emerged twice from his ranch in Chiapas, to once to promote his own book, and another time I think, to criticize the Maduro kidnapping in Venezuela. So he has given her the spotlight, but we also know, his son is uh, heavily involved in Morena politics, and I'm quite certain there's still some back channel, involvement there. But it has given Sheinbaum the chance to really step into the spotlight. And I think a lot of the kind of frankly, quite misogynist kind of critiques that I think she was experiencing at the beginning. And I even noticed it in the language that I used in my stories at times, where I would talk about, um, oh, he's her political mentor. Can she step out of his shadow? Like at times it felt like I wondered whether I had been would have been writing that if they were two male politicians. But I think, to her credit, she really has. She has become, the face of Mexico. People are really happy with her. Her approval ratings are like 75%, one of the most popular politicians on earth at this point. And I think a way that she's actually, it's kind of ironic, but I think she's actually benefited politically from the confrontations with Trump, because it has allowed her to present herself as this strong defender of Mexico's sovereignty. Whether or not that's actually what's happening, I think is another conversation, but she's come across as this very graceful and pragmatic, and she's come across as a very strong leader. And Trump has even said that. And so I think that ironically has, an enemy to kind of unite Mexicans. And so there's also been kind of a surge of nationalism here that has also benefited her. Mm-hmm. But policy-wise, I mean, I think she has largely continued with his policies, although on security in particular, it seems to be a place where she is trying different and I think, frankly, smarter things than AMLO did, putting more emphasis on intelligence, the police, and just kind of going after organized crime in tougher ways than AMLO did.
Mm-hmm. So this is a great transition to talk about, she had very little time to get her footing in Palacio Nacional before the inauguration of Trump on January 20th. And I wonder, reflecting on that shift, how she had to pivot in terms of the important issues. We know that 80% of Mexican export go to the United States. It's heavily dependent on that to sustain the economy. And her programs are heavily dependent on the economy doing well to have the money to do that. So it's a very important and touchy issue, the U.S.-Mexico relation. But Donald Trump came breaking everything in the room. And I wonder what are how she changed. She had to change her priorities to adjust, and whether or not you have a reflection. You already mentioned that people think that she has handled this very well, but if you can go into detail about, how she had to compromise to some things about on her agenda with this new political moment. How does it feel from Mexico, that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's hard to overstate the existential threat that Trump posed to Mexico, to its economy, and also to her and the legacy of, honestly, of Morena, AMLO's legacy. Yeah, because if the economy tanks because Mexico is suddenly, slapped with 50% or higher tariffs, the whole project, right, of reducing inequality is no longer. So, she, from the beginning, I think, she cited this like comic book figure, what's his name, Kaliman, I think, and who is known for, kind of defeating his villains with this very like patient and serene kind of attitude. And she said, right before he was even sworn in, that was the attitude she was going to take. And so publicly, that has very much been her mantra, that that they are having this very respectful dialogue, that she is defending Mexican sovereignty, that Mexico is willing to cooperate, but not be subordinate to the U.S. And Trump has, for the most part, praised her, honestly, more than most other world leaders. So by all appearances, they have actually a very productive and more positive relationship than most. And she has successfully convinced Trump to not apply sweeping tariffs, to not send U.S. troops or use U.S. technology to attack cartels yet. And yeah, so she's sort of, on the face of things, like had very successfully managed the relationship with Trump. But you're right, this has come at, Mexico has also given Trump a lot. And so we see that, I think, most clearly with security, where it has become just a huge priority for her administration. And not necessarily to reduce violence, although I think that's been a byproduct, but she's under pressure to actually show like deliverables to Trump, which look like, this is how many drug laboratories we destroyed. This is how much fentanyl we've seized. This is how many cartel members we have arrested. And here, actually, would you like 100 of them? We'll send 100 of them to you, even though they've not faced trial in Mexico, to face trial in the United States. And then on other issues as well, she's recently agreed, it appears, to stop sending oil shipments to Cuba. So she's had this like very, very difficult task of like appeasing him publicly, appeasing him with these concrete deliverables, while also, I think, maintaining this posture of strength for the Mexican people and defense of Mexican sovereignty. So it's a really difficult, challenging dance, but I think most people would agree that she's kind of done a very artful job with it. But I think you're right that this has eclipsed so many of her like domestic policies and goals. I mean, it's become one of, if not kind of the most important things that she's had to do as a president, is manage a relationship with a really potentially destructive force. And so yeah, I think we're still sort of waiting to see exactly like how much Mexico is willing to give, how much she's willing to give. But at the moment, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I wanted to bring up a recent story that you wrote for the LA Times, and it was very sobering that despite the fact that Clara Sheinbaum has a lot of support within Mexico, despite the fact that she's even recognized and getting praise for Trump, there are dissident voices, right? The opposition is trying to resist. And your article, you mentioned, and you interview people who were supportive of U.S. intervention because they were so, their narrative about Mexico, that Mexico was so lost its way that only a North American intervention could right the ship. Could you reflect on that? That was it's not, of course, everybody. It's a small number of people, but just the fact that people were expressing that. Can you talk about that story, the reporting, and what you took away? It sounded like actually you were surprised about what you were hearing. Just give us some details about that.
Yeah, I was surprised. And, I think for me, a really kind of a theme that I've just been very interested in exploring here and throughout Latin America is the impact of violence on, people's lives and economies, but also politics. Because we have seen in this region some really interesting trends in recent years. The rise of Nayib Bukele and his kind of, I guess you could call it security populism, where he has cracked down and imprisoned, 2% of the adult population of his country to tackle gangs and maintain incredible popularity, is this indication, I think, of just how exhausted people are by violence. And I think sort of understanding like that, the impact of that on people's like everyday experience is really important. And I think there have been some populist figures like Bukele, and now many people throughout Latin America who are copying his rhetoric and his policies. They've understood that and have profited from it. So that's sort of like an idea I've had in my head, or I've spent time in El Salvador and looked at the Bukele kind of impact elsewhere, and found, right, that there were a lot of people for whom it was more important to have security than to have democracy, for example, or, free elections, or it was more important to have security than perhaps in this case, sovereignty. So there were a couple polls in Mexico that showed, that maybe about half of Mexicans would not oppose U.S. intervention. And so this happened right after there had been the kind of horrific public killing of a Michoacan mayor who had been, some people called him the Bukele of Mexico, because he had really been saying, like, we have to go after these criminals with all we've got. They don't deserve free trials. We need to throw them in jail, or worse. And so it just seemed this interesting moment to talk to people about what they thought. And yeah, it was very fascinating that a lot of people felt like the things have gotten so sort of out of control here. The Mexican government has not shown that it's capable of confronting organized crime that is not just drug trafficking, but is, extortion and controlling entire industries, and gasoline theft. And it's just like so insidious at this point. And really more resembles, I think, like sort of gang life in maybe LA in the 80s or 90s. And so, yeah, so a lot of people kind of said that they would be willing to have the US involved. And this actually just makes me think of one other thing that's also surprised me. But, so many people were outraged by the US attack on Venezuela and the capture of Nicolas Maduro. And I frankly expected, that most Latin Americans would be outraged about this too. But I was surprised that polls show that a majority of people, and I think like 8 out of 9 countries surveyed actually, supported the fact that Maduro was out, which is not specifically related to crime, but just again, kind of surprises people, or at least surprised me.
Okay. But there's numbers also for Mexico in terms of Venezuela. I didn't look at
So
that.
Mexico was the one country where there was not a majority of people who supported yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And no, it's complicated, right? For Claudia Sheinbaum to face these issues. The other issue that really grabbed my attention is your reporting on Mexican Americans who have been deported, and you have a story of deportees to the state of Michoacan, and it was interesting to read that article, because many times we don't think about Mexicans being deported to a place where they're in danger, right? They're going to go to Mexico, and it's not the same as being deported to maybe El Salvador or Haiti. But you point out to some very stark issues there. Can you share with us some of the details of what you found with these reporting of deportees going back to their hometowns, especially those in Michoacan?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, Trump, in contrast to Biden and Obama, he will deport anyone, including people who have very, very long ties to the United States. So I think you're seeing an increase of people who have been in the US for 20, 30 years, who really have their entire lives there, who are suddenly being, thrust back into a country that is theirs and is also not theirs. And of course, what else has happened over the last 20, 30 years? Well, like Mexico has begun to have a very, very big problem with uh, organized crime. And so, yeah, you have people returning to communities that have been pretty transformed. And I think Michoacan is clearly an epicenter right now of it just highlights, how bad the situation has gotten in parts of the country. You have, armed groups in Michoacan now who are using basically weapons of war. I mean, they're they're planting bombs. They have these crazy drones equipped with this explosives. They have homemade tanks, and they have mercenary fighters from Colombia, Ukraine. They have people, literally contract killers, basically coming to just to train their members in these sort of ever more brutal like tactics of war. So it really is, parts of the state are really, really conflictive right now. And so, yeah, I talked to a guy who came back and did not recognize his town. There was now no nightlife, like the dances in the plaza, all the things that, reminded him of home were no longer. And he had to leave in part because of extortion, because in that town where he was, like you couldn't have a business or even do day labor without paying somebody protection money. Not the situation in all of Mexico, but the situation in parts of it.
And just a last question before we give the chance to the participants, the audience, to ask questions. We can talk all day, but let's give them the chance to talk. I wonder if you could share with us what characters and what news you're going to be following up this year. What are you planning to write about? What are you intrigued?
Yeah, I mean, my editor would also like to know. I think one thing I think is kind of coming back to what we've been talking about is because I think sort of one of the biggest vulnerabilities of like Sheinbaum or Morena generally is if you had a candidate who was coming in with this kind of security populist messaging, who like Bukele was kind of calling for much more extreme measures but just really talking to the people in a way that resonated. And so, like, I think that's fertile ground. You've seen that in a lot of other places in Mexico, and frankly, Trump kind of emulates some of that. So it's a pretty tried and true tactic. But I think she's kind of trying to combat that, and I think a lot of it rests on the success of her security policies, and also one man who is Omar Garcia Harfuch, who is her basically head of security. That is his role, and he did a very good job in that role while he was in that same role as when she was mayor of Mexico City. And so I think there's a big question of can he replicate that at the national level, and what would that look like? And I think another big question is like thinking about the economy. Claudia Sheinbaum kind of began her presidency with this desire to make a lot more contracts with particularly Asian countries and bring a lot more industry to Mexico, make Mexico producing things for Mexico consumption, not just the US. Under pressure from President Trump, she actually has had to kind of waver a bit, and he's kind of convinced her or pressured her to put some tariffs on certain Asian countries. So like whether or not that industrial plan that she had hoped that she had hoped would really invigorate the economy, whether or not she's able to actually make that happen, I think is a big question. I think, what happens with the US economy, and which obviously has huge impacts on the Mexican economy, is another big question. In more kind of fun cultural news, the World Cup is going to be held here and in the US and Canada. And that will just be fun and interesting times. that is also sure here in Mexico City specifically to kind of further fuel this gentrification process that's been happening and that has, I think, caught a lot of US headlines, just the kind of dichotomy that's so uncomfortable of the fact that you have Mexican immigrants in the US who are being deported because they can't live and work there. Whereas here in Mexico, you have this boom of immigration of US, expats, remote workers who want to take advantage of sort of lower prices here to work. So kind of tensions with that potentially. And then what happens with immigration? Because you have this bizarre thing where, I mean, it's just insane. Like migration has stopped. Like, for the entire 10 years I was here, it was just a question of, who was migrating to the US and why and what routes they were taking. But there was never a question of, there was never no migrants. And Trump's rhetoric and his very, aggressive policies have really stopped this for now, or really slowed it. And so it's so bizarre. These like shelters on the border are just like, the border is a ghost town. There's none of the kind of, you have like, shelters that are going out of business because they like have no population to serve. So looking at that, and does that change? And then the sort of a down wind effect of that is, many of those people who wanted to migrate to the US are in fact staying in Mexico. And so what does that look like? You have populations of Venezuelans and Haitians and Cubanos who have been either deported or got stranded here, who are trying to integrate themselves into Mexico and shaping it. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer, but there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of so much to be watching.
Thank you for sharing that, and we're going to be looking forward to reading those articles too. So let's open it up for the audience. If you have a question, just maybe raise your hand and I can allow you to, and maybe also Ari, if you can help me, if there are questions from the audience and we can give them the chance to allow them to talk. I wonder if we can see Ari, if they raise their hand. Yeah, okay. Sophia, go for it, Sophia.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
I have a question about how your experience is reporting in Mexico as like a female white American, and how those identities can maybe like support your reporting at times and building relationships with sources, and then maybe I imagine hinder it at other times. So curious just to hear about that, and also how you overcome any barriers that you may face.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think on the whole, I think I really benefit from kind of the privilege of this blue American passport, because I think it protects me a lot. Mexico is one of the deadliest countries in the world for journalists, with like a dozen journalists killed here every year. They are almost exclusively local journalists, mostly people at the very local level who are doing the very brave and important and dangerous work of exposing ties between like local corrupt politicians or local organized crime, and are harmed because of it. So I think, if something were to happen, I think there's a sense that if something were to happen to a U.S. journalist, there would be a lot of attention on that. It would be bad for the people that did it, more problems than it was worth. And so, yeah, I think we have a lot more sort of ability to move in places sometimes. But yeah, I mean, also though, I grew up in a Latino community in New Mexico, and I spent most of my time, before this, like reporting on immigration in LA. But I'm not from this culture. And so sometimes I think there are like maybe potentially advantages to that, because like the things you notice, as an outsider can be helpful, but then other times, that this isn't my culture. Sometimes I wonder if these are my stories to be telling. And so, yeah, so these are questions I think about a lot, and don't know if I have like clear answers to, but it's more just like these are like our identities are things that we kind of grapple with all the time as we go about, as we go in the world. And so I will say I do think being like a male foreign correspondent is easier in a lot of ways in terms of like talking to politicians or law enforcement, because half the time like I feel like they're potentially going to be creepy with me. But being a woman also like gets you access to other women in a way that is very special. And I felt that, for example, covering like stories of migration sometimes, where the ability to just sit down with a woman and whatever, talk about your kids, and there's just like a lot of also potential for a connection there too. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you, Sophia. Anyone else? Just raise your hands and I can put you in line to ask Kate any questions you might be wondering. And while we wait, I think would you say something about um, Clara Burgada, the mayor of Mexico City, another powerful woman, leftist? She I don't know. She hasn't been on the news a lot. She sort of disappeared. I wonder what happened. I mean, everybody had a lot of expectations because she was following Claudia's path to the presidency. But what's happening there with Clara?
Clara, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think of her as like, when you think about that big tent of Morena that we discussed, I think of her as like, she's the most left. She's really this um, pretty militant leftist who rose in the party, and she was the mayor of Iztapalapa, and I think there did some pretty cool things, specifically around public safety. And she's, I think, trying to replicate that literally as we speak. They're like installing these giant lights outside of my house, which is part of this citywide push that she has to literally illuminate the city. And she says that in Iztapalapa that helped like reduce homicides. So yeah, I mean, she had sort of this terrible thing happen right when she was elected, where two of her top aides were murdered. And
right.
The details around that killing are still quite murky, why they were targeted. I think, perhaps like as I think there's now a sense that going in, we're 4 years away from the next election. But if you think of some potential front runners as her, Marcelo Ebrard, and probably Garcia Harfuch also, who I think has very presidential ambitions as well. I would say that Harfuch and Ebrard seem to be the two kind of candidates to beat at this point. But that's a good question, and something that I'm gonna sort of look into or keep thinking about.
Anyone else in the audience? Because we can continue talking. We have a few more minutes. Let's hit the hour. Let's see.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I would also just be curious, like, to hear from members of the audience about sort of what they think generally about kind of coverage of Mexico, what they'd like to see more of. Just any reflections on sort of how Mexico is portrayed. That would be a cool opportunity to hear some feedback on that.
Let's see if I can. Sophia, let me. Oh, sorry.
Hello?
Go ahead. Yes, go
Oh,
ahead.
hi. Sorry, me again. I really appreciated your response to the other questions. I am a white female reporter in Los Angeles, reporting immigration. They're questions I often ask myself about as well. So it's been super inspiring to hear you speak. I have a question about, you mentioned El Salvador, and here in Los Angeles, there's a big Salvadoran population, and Bukele, as you mentioned, is still very popular despite sort of authoritarian tactics. I'm curious how any, broad support in Latin America, but I'm curious what you're hearing about people's response to Bukele in Mexico specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly always shocked by anywhere in Latin America, like how many places I've been and I've heard people say like, we need a Bukele here. We need, and it's really impressive. The guy has incredible name recognition throughout the region, and yeah, I think he's like a master of social media, and also, has invested heavily in troll farms and things like that to kind of amplify his message. So he's really a very present character. And it's fascinating because, when I entered, it was sort of the end of the pink tide, and these really strong leftists throughout the region, and, from Venezuela to Brazil. And so now you have in sort of the rest of the region a lot of right-wing candidates rising, many of whom have sort of authoritarian or anti-democratic tendencies, from Bukele to Cast in Chile to Milei in Argentina, Ecuador as well. But then now you have in Mexico, whereas before during the pink tide, you had kind of more conservatives in Mexico. Now you have kind of conservatives everywhere else, and in Mexico, like, this big leftist movement. So it's funny how Mexico is kind of out of step with the rest of the region, just in terms of that kind of political pendulum. But so here, yeah, even though, Sheinbaum and Morena is in power, there is just like a ton of interest in who is Bukele. I was with a friend from Michoacan recently who said that he was looking at his mom's feed, and it was like 1 in every 5 videos was like Bukele talking about what he had done in El Salvador. So I think there's a lot of interest in those ideas here. And that is why I think, like for Sheinbaum, it's actually like a kind of an existential question that she at least makes the appearance of doing something about security here, because I think there's an opening for another kind of Bukele imitator to challenge her here.
Yeah. So let's bring in Diane Ross. Can you ask your question, please?
Hi.
Hi.
Husband and I work in Chiapas, and we have a lot of Mayan friends and acquaintances, and several of them are being deported and have family members who are very afraid that they might be deported. Many of them still have debts to pay off there, which is why they're in the United States working. We were just wondering if there's any talk, much talk from Sheinbaum about what to do with all of this labor, that there's no industry to sop them up with down in those states, Chiapas, Oaxaca, and especially in the southeast. That's the question.
Thank you, Diane.
That's a good question. And that's actually like a good story idea because it costs so much to, be smuggled into the US at this point, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, that a lot of people do go into serious debt. And that would actually be an interesting thing to look at with people who've been deported and are also in debt because of that. So thank you for the idea. But yeah, I mean, no, Sheinbaum hasn't really addressed this. And, the Mexican government has started this program, Mexico te abraza, algo así. And they're like, giving $100 and like a bus ticket to people who are deported. But that's kind of the extent of the support that she's announced. And you're absolutely right that there are parts of the country where, there are parts of Oaxaca and Chiapas where working as a farmhand, you earn maybe like $8 a day. And that's why people left in the first place. AMLO had kind of these programs that were meant to kind of help farmers in particular, that I think were somewhat successful. And he also, had these programs that Sheinbaum has continued of giving like older people and students and certain populations, almost like a universal basic income. But for like a working aged, person who does not fit into those categories, it can be really hard. I think, that's part of why she had this Plan Mexico that she announced and that I briefly talked about, where she was like, it was really an attempt to kind of bring more industrial projects to Mexico. But like I said, that's been a bit sidelined because of the Trump stuff, because who wants to invest in Mexico if you're afraid that literally tomorrow you could have to pay, an extra 50% or 70% to get your goods into the United States, which is where these goods are all destined to go. So, yeah, I mean, I think the economy, like the security thing, I think the economy is like her biggest Achilles heel right now. It's just not growing at the rate that Mexico wants, that it needs. And yeah, I'm not sure that she has a plan. I think the one kind of good thing for Mexico so far is, even though the images that we see coming out of the United States are so dramatic and horrifying, and the rhetoric is so pumped up around immigration, Mexico is not actually seeing many more deportees than in previous administrations. So Trump's rhetoric isn't really matching. He's not deporting 1 million people a year, which is what he promised. And so, because, there still are immigration laws, and, a lot of people are in detention, and detention levels are high, but Mexico has not been flooded with returnees at this point. I think that could change in the next couple of years. And you're right that is, a really tricky question.
Okay. So we have time for a few more questions, and I'm going to ask Citlali to ask her question. Go ahead, Citlali.
Hi, this is Citlali. I work for the Division of Social Sciences at UCLA. And Kate, a long time ago, I worked at SCIU, and I remember
Yes.
you covering some of our immigration marches then. So it's very nice to see you again, and I've been following your work throughout the years. I think my comment is related to what we were just talking about. I think from like a US audience standpoint, I think I have been thinking about, like, while the numbers have not matched the rhetoric, we do hear of people who have opted to either self-deport or have decided to go back. And I think it would be interesting to see, so like, how are things going over time? Like, are they able to make a life there? Because I do see particularly elders here in Los Angeles kind of thinking about that prospect, just because of when we see increased immigration rates, it makes it really unsafe or people are not moving about Los Angeles like they were in the past, depending on where you live, or just overall, depending on the month or week and the raids. I have seen some coverage of that in the LA Times. Actually, it was interesting. It was one example, but he had just returned, and I was wondering, like, over time, how folks are adapting and how Mexican society is receiving them. And then the other thing I've been thinking about is remittances, and overall the economy isn't where it used to be here in the States, and I'm wondering what impacts that's having on families in Mexico, or if there are growing industries out there, or how people are surviving. But yeah, just and also, like, I just want to comment, I've loved how you've been able to cover pressing news events and at the same time sprinkling in some really cool cultural articles. I appreciate those too. So anyway, that's the extent of my comments.
Thank you,
Wow,
Citlali.
thank you. Yeah. Oh, thank you. It's so nice to see your name and hear your voice, because I remember being like so inspired by the work that you guys were doing, and just thinking about how the labor movement was so involved in that push for immigration reform, and it's crazy because at that point we were talking about like immigration reform and expanding DACA, and it's just crazy how in the US now it's like the goalpost has changed. Now it's just about defending. And I know that everyone on this call and that all of you in the US, like, I know that it's been a very heavy and intense time, and it's been a bit surreal, honestly, watching this all unfold from Mexico. But yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. Like, I think that's a great idea, honestly, just to follow people over time. Those are always kind of how you get like really rich stories, because dropping in with someone at one point in their life, you get one perspective, but seeing how things evolve is always wonderful. I remembered I did some work like that when I first got here. I spent like about a year with some families in a town, people who had come back, and I think it's time to do that again. I mean, it's hard to say how. I think Mexico generally, I think people feel really sympathetic to migrants in the U.S. and very grateful to them. It's like a huge part of Mexican GDP is remittances. And so I think there's like a sense of indebtedness to people who have spent time there. And so I hope that translates to kind of, open arms and policies that help people with the very basic stuff that you need when you return to Mexico, which is, do you have identification? Do you have work papers like that allow you to work? If you have kids, can you get them enrolled in school? Maybe they're US kids or, Mexican, but haven't lived here for years. Maybe they only speak English. Like, there's so many kind of practical challenges, I think, to reintegration that are very much worth exploring and will be very present. It's like, on the one hand, Mexico, I mean, these communities have like 30, 40 years of practice with this. But of course, like in the last, 20 years, as deportations have ramped up in the US, it's become much more potent. But that conversation between US and Mexico happens at a million different levels every moment of every day. There's just this, like, I mean, like you all know, there's just these are two places that are forever entwined on a cultural, economic, familial level. And so yeah, just seeing how those kind of that morphs and the new things that arise. I mean, yeah, I'll be definitely like sort of looking at all of that. And yeah, I mean, I think it's like this, I don't know, it's just like we're watching this kind of great American tragedy unfold, and seeing, yeah, I think you have like this is going to be a whole generation of people who are coming back here, who are traumatized by this, who maybe are going to think about the US in different ways. Like, we're at a time of great shifting. And so it's just, yeah, it's going to be really fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Thank you, Kate. And maybe on a lighter note, to close
Yeah.
your presentation, what's going on with massive concerts in Mexico? I mean, President Sheinbaum wrote to the South Korea government to ask for more concert. There's not a crisis there, right? I mean, everybody wants tickets for the World Cup are selling
you're
like
touching
pancakes. What's going on?
I mean, basically there's like total fraud and crazy. There's no regulation. And so a big concert is announced and all these like either bots or like scalpers get all the tickets, and then no true fans can go, and then they hike the prices up like crazy. And this happened this week. Yeah, like the Mexican president literally wrote to the Korean president asking for more BTS concerts here. Like, we need more K-pop. So that was cool. But you're touching on a personally very like sensitive topic, because I couldn't get tickets to see Bad Bunny. He played 10 dates here. So I bought on one of these like resale things. And the day of the concert came and the tickets were fake.
No.
So
Okay.
yeah, so this is like
So
a
you
very
showed
fresh
up
trauma.
and they let you in, or what happened?
They didn't let me in, and then I did a really crazy thing, and I spent like way too much money on like another scalped ticket. Anyway, I'm out like. Anyway,
Okay.
yeah, there's yeah.
Wow, it's
Yeah.
complicated. Wow. Okay. And is the same thing with the World Cup? I mean, is
Yeah,
there
that's
all
it.
these
I need to
also?
get in. I need to learn more about like what's happening with the World Cup tickets and stuff. But you know, Mexico, like people are very ingenious here, and lots of like scheming, and yeah. So there's people trying to make a buck off of it for sure. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Kate, for such an engaging conversation. We really appreciate it. We keep reading your stories, so keep it up, and looking forward to see what you write in the following month. So.